The Third Pew from the Front. Chapter 1. The Creature of Habit. I have always been, as my late husband Gerald would say with precisely the kind of fondness that borders on exasperation, a woman of magnificent stubbornness. He didn't mean it as a criticism. Or if he did, he was smart enough to deliver it with a smile. And I always took it as a compliment. There is nothing wrong with knowing what you like, knowing where you belong, and planting yourself there with the quiet certainty of a well-rooted oak. Gerald, God rest his soul, was the spontaneous one. The one who would suggest, on a perfectly good Tuesday evening, that we drive 45 minutes to try a new restaurant, because he'd heard from a man at the hardware store that their clam chowder was absolutely transformative. The one who'd rearrange the living room furniture on a whim, and stand back admiring it with his hands on his hips, as though he'd just completed a masterwork. The one who, in 31 years of marriage, never once sat in the same chair twice at his own kitchen table, just to keep things, as he put it, fresh. I, on the other hand, had a chair. I had a mug. The blue one with the slightly chipped rim that he kept threatening to throw away. I had a side of the bed, a preferred checkout lane at the grocery store, and a pew. The third pew from the front, left side, St. Brendan's Church of the Redeemer, corner of Maple and Glenwood. We had been sitting there since the year we moved to Millhaven, which was 1987, which, before you do the math and give me that look, was a very long time ago. I found the pew first. It happened almost by accident. We were late to our very first Sunday service, because Gerald had insisted on making a full-cooked breakfast, which took twice as long as anticipated, because he burned the first batch of bacon and then dropped an egg, and by the time we arrived, most of the back pews were already full of people who had planned their mornings better than we had. So we shuffled up toward the front, still smelling faintly of burnt pork, and we slid into the third pew on the left. And that was that. The third pew had a slightly squeaky board on the right end, which Gerald said he rather liked because it meant you always knew who was coming and going. It had a small carved groove near the hymnal holder. I always thought it looked like a lopsided duck. Gerald insisted it was a boat. And it had a particular quality of light on Sunday mornings that came through the tall amber window above the side altar and landed just so, warm and golden, like something specifically arranged. We sat there every single Sunday for 31 years. 48 weeks a year, give or take. We skipped occasionally for Christmas in Vermont, or Easter with Gerald's sister in Savannah, but those felt like authorized absences, properly negotiated with the Almighty. The rest of the time, we were in that pew. Me first, Gerald a few minutes later. Because no matter what time we left the house, he could always find something on the way out the door that needed attending to. A loose button. An umbrella that might be needed. A phone charger he was suddenly certain he'd forgotten, checked twice, hadn't. He would slide in beside me, always with a small exhale, as if he'd been running, even when he'd been doing nothing of the sort. And he'd give my hand a brief squeeze, which was his way of saying both, hello, and, sorry I'm late, and, isn't it good to be here, all at once. And then he'd open the program with a little rustle, and lean over to whisper something in my ear, usually a mild but affectionate observation about someone else's hat. That was Gerald. That was us. That was the third pew from the front. Chapter 2. What the Empty Seat Knows. Gerald died on a Thursday in November, 3 years ago. He had been perfectly fine on Wednesday. Or so we thought. Which is one of the many ways the universe likes to remind you that it operates on its own schedule, and does not send courtesy notifications. A quick illness, the doctors called it. Which is a clinical way of saying that the world can change its entire shape inside of 48 hours, and there isn't a thing you can do about it. I won't linger on all of that, if you don't mind. Not because it isn't worth talking about. It is. But because this is meant to be the kind of story that ends with you smiling rather than reaching for a tissue, and I have other things to tell you. What I will say is this. The Sunday after Gerald's funeral, I went to church. My daughter Helen thought I should wait. My son-in-law David thought a brisk walk in the park might be more restorative. My neighbor Barbara brought over a casserole of such ambitious structural ambiguity that I'm still not entirely sure what was in it, and suggested I eat it and rest. They all meant well. They always do. But I put on my good coat. The charcoal wool one. Not the puffy one that Gerald always said made me look like a very dignified marshmallow. And I drove to St. Brendan's. And I walked up the aisle. And I sat down in the third pew on the left. And I left the seat beside me empty. I'm not sure I made a conscious decision about it. I simply sat where I always sat, the way you simply breathe, without deliberating over whether today might be a good day to try something different. The pew was ours. The space beside me had always been his. It still was, in all the ways that mattered. Which is to say, in all the ways that can't be measured or argued with. I won't pretend no one noticed. People notice everything in a church the size of St. Brendan's, which seats approximately 200, but operates on the social intimacy of a village of 12. Mrs. Kowalski, who sat 2 rows back and had the observational powers of a very devoted hawk, definitely noticed. I could feel her noticing. The way you can feel a draft even before you find the window. But nobody said anything. Not at first. For the first few months, I think people assumed I was grieving in a way that should be handled carefully, like a package marked fragile, which I suppose I was. They'd smile at me, a particular kind of careful smile that said, "We see you and we're sorry and we are not going to bring up the empty seat." So I just kept sitting there. Week after week. November into December, December into the new year. The new year into spring and summer and another fall, and then another year on top of that. The empty seat became as much a part of the third pew as the squeaky board and the lopsided duck. It was simply how things were. What I didn't fully anticipate was how the empty seat would develop. There is no other word for it. A reputation. It started, I believe, with the Hendersons' teenage son, Marcus, who made the mistake of trying to sit there one Sunday, when the church was unusually crowded due to a visiting choir from Akron, who had drawn a larger than typical audience. Marcus was 16, built like he'd recently discovered a gym, and hadn't quite figured out what to do with the information. And he dropped into Gerald's seat with the casual bonelessness of a teenager, who believes furniture exists purely for his convenience. I looked at him. I want to be clear. I did not say anything. I did not make a scene. I am a 71-year-old woman, with 31 years of marriage, and 3 years of widowhood behind her. And I have long since learned that the things you do not say are often considerably more powerful than the things you do. Marcus lasted approximately 45 seconds. Then he mumbled something about thinking this might be someone's seat, and relocated himself to the back row, where he spent the rest of the service staring at his shoes. Word got around, as word does. Chapter 3. The Theology of the Reserved Seat. By the time Father Dominic asked me about the seat, it had achieved something approaching legendary status in the congregation of St. Brendan's. I only know the full extent of this because my friend Rosalie, who is constitutionally incapable of keeping information to herself for longer than 48 hours, told me about it over coffee one Tuesday morning, with the gleeful energy of someone delivering excellent gossip. "People think it's a memorial," Rosalie said, wrapping both hands around her mug. She has a way of delivering news that makes everything sound like the title of a documentary. "They think you've officially designated the seat as a kind of a spiritual placeholder." "A spiritual placeholder," I repeated. Margaret Finch told her daughter, who told Dave Kowalski. "Yes, Barbara's husband. That you keep the seat empty because you believe Gerald's spirit attends Mass with you every Sunday." I considered this. "That's rather poetic." "It's entirely bonkers," Rosalie said, not without affection. "But also, I mean." She tilted her head. "Is it true?" "I keep the seat empty because it's Gerald's seat," I said. "Whether his spirit sits in it is frankly between him and the Almighty, and I don't presume to have detailed information on the matter." Rosalie looked satisfied with this answer, in the way that people look satisfied when they've received something they can work with. The theology of the reserved seat, as I came to think of it, produced a remarkable variety of interpretations around the parish. There was the poetic school. Gerald's spirit attends Mass. The sentimental school. Clara is keeping his memory alive in a beautiful way. The practical school. She just hasn't gotten around to changing her habits, which is very Clara. And the slightly worried school, represented primarily by Father Dominic himself, who I think genuinely wasn't sure whether I was managing my grief in a healthy way, or had entered into some kind of theological arrangement that might require pastoral intervention. Father Dominic. Young, earnest, the kind of priest who remembers everyone's birthday, and takes very careful notes during confession, which is slightly unnerving but I suppose points to a thoroughness of character. Had been circling the question for months. I could tell. He'd pause when he greeted me after the service. He'd let the silence stretch just a half-second longer than usual, as if hoping I might volunteer the explanation before he had to ask for it. But I am, as Gerald would confirm from wherever he now resides, a woman of magnificent stubbornness. And I do not generally volunteer explanations for things I don't consider to require explanation. The Sunday he finally asked was the last Sunday of February, the kind of pale, scrubbed day that makes everything look like it's been washed and not quite dried. The service had been particularly good. Father Dominic gave a homily about the loaves and fishes that was, I thought, more interesting than usual, because he spent several minutes imagining what the crowd's reaction must have been right before the miracle. That specific human moment of, well, this is going to be embarrassing for everyone. Which I felt was a very honest reading of the text. I was gathering my things. My bag, my program, the reading glasses I had nearly left in the pew, which would have been the third time this month. When Father Dominic appeared at the end of the row, with his hands folded in that particular way priests have, that suggests both approachability and the possibility of serious conversation. "Mrs. Clara," he said. "Good morning." "Good morning, Father." He glanced, briefly but unmistakably, at the empty seat. Then back at me. "I hope you don't mind my asking, Are you waiting for someone? Now, I could have given him the simple answer. I could have said, "It's habit, Father, nothing more or less." And it would have been true. But something about the careful sincerity of how he asked it. Not prying, genuinely curious. The way a good doctor asks a question because he actually wants to understand the patient, not because he's running through a checklist, made me want to give him the real answer, which is not always the same as the simple one. I smiled. I looked at the seat, and then back at him. "It is a habit of mine," I said. "It makes the service feel just like it used to. Back when my husband was still here by my side." Father Dominic looked at me for a moment. Something moved across his face that was not quite sadness and not quite relief. More like understanding. The kind that settles quietly rather than announcing itself. "That's a beautiful reason," he said. "Well," I said, tucking my reading glasses into my bag. "It's the true one." I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong, but I didn't know that yet. I was still operating under the assumption that a simple, honest answer resolves a thing, rather than simply adding fuel to it. Chapter 4. An unexpected development. The trouble. If you could call it trouble. It was more like a low-grade comic disruption. The kind Gerald would have adored. Began the following Sunday, when I arrived at the third pew to find a single white carnation lying on the empty seat. I picked it up and looked around. The church was in its usual pre-service state. People filing in, bulletins rustling. Mrs. Kowalski occupying her customary 2 rows back and radiating alertness. Nobody met my eyes in the particular way that suggests guilty awareness. I set the carnation on the hymnal ledge, where it leaned at a slight angle for the entirety of the service, and I decided not to think too hard about it. The next Sunday, there were 2 carnations. The Sunday after that, there was a small handwritten note on a folded piece of paper that read, in careful cursive, "Praying for you and for Gerald. A friend." I found this touching, and also mildly baffling, and also I suspected very strongly that it was Rosalie, because the handwriting had a particular looping quality to the capital letters that I had seen on birthday cards for 23 years. When I raised this theory with her over coffee that Tuesday, she denied it with an energy that struck me as frankly overdone. "It could be anyone," she said, examining her muffin with great attention. "It does look rather like your G's." I said, "I have very common G's." I let it go. This is one of the skills marriage teaches you, and widowhood refines. Knowing when you've made your point and pursuing it further will only tire you both. But Rosalie was not, as it turned out, the only one. Because word of Father Dominic's conversation with me, specifically the part about the habit, and how it made the service feel as it used to, had done what words do in a small parish. It had traveled. And somewhere in its traveling, it had gathered layers, the way a snowball picks up snow. By the time the story reached the far reaches of the congregation, I was reportedly carrying on a lifelong act of devotion so poignant that several people had teared up hearing about it, and at least one person. I was told this by Rosalie with a kind of odd horror. Had described it to their adult children in another state as the most romantic thing I've heard since that movie with the notebook. I am not entirely sure which movie this refers to, but I gathered from context it was not a comedy. The carnations continued. A small laminated photo of a saint appeared one Sunday, tucked against the hymnal, which I assumed was meant to be protective in nature. A rosary appeared the week after, which I placed carefully in my bag because it seemed rude to leave it on the pew. A small knitted square of fabric, purpose unclear. A coaster? A patch? A meditation aid? Appeared the Sunday after that, and I kept it too. Because it clearly represented effort. Helen, my daughter, called me on a Saturday evening in April and said, "Mom, someone from the church phoned me." "Oh?" I said. She wanted to know if there was a plaque being considered for Dad's seat. I was quiet for a moment. A plaque. A commemorative plaque. She said she knew someone who did engraving at very reasonable rates. "Helen," I said carefully. "No." I told her I didn't think you'd want that. "No plaque," I confirmed. "Your father would have found a plaque absolutely mortifying. He could barely tolerate his name on the Christmas program." This was true. Gerald had an almost constitutional modesty about public acknowledgement. He once spent 3 weeks dreading a retirement party that a former colleague was throwing him, spent the entire party looking as though he was being gently tortured, and then on the drive home said, he supposed it was very kind of them, bless their hearts. A plaque on a church pew would have sent him to an early, well, a different kind of early grave than the one he found, at any rate. The apex of the whole situation, however, arrived not in the form of a plaque but in the form of a man named Harold. Harold Baxter was 73, recently retired from a career in regional insurance that he described as perfectly adequate, a widower of 4 years, and, as I would later piece together, the victim of a very enthusiastic piece of matchmaking by Mrs. Kowalski, who had apparently decided that my empty seat and Harold's empty Sunday mornings were a problem that could be solved simultaneously with one strategic introduction. He appeared beside me in the third pew on the first Sunday in May. Just appeared. Sat down in Gerald's seat with a slightly formal air, as if he'd made an appointment and was determined to keep it, and said, in a low, polite voice, "Mrs. Clara? I'm Harold." Dolores Kowalski suggested I introduce myself. I looked at him. He was a tidy sort of man. Pressed trousers, sensible shoes. The kind of neat mustache that suggests regular attendance at a proper barber. He looked mildly terrified, which I found somewhat reassuring. "Did she?" I said. "She said you might appreciate some company," he said. "On Sunday mornings." I looked at the seat he was sitting in. He followed my gaze. A flicker of something. Alarm, possibly. Crossed his face. "Is this? Should I not?" "No, no," I said, and surprised myself by meaning it. "It's quite all right." We sat through the service in companionable silence, which is actually one of the better ways to spend time with someone you don't know, because it removes the pressure of performing conversation, and reveals instead whether a person can simply be still without fidgeting or whispering unnecessary things. Harold, I noted, could. He sat upright, followed the liturgy with what appeared to be genuine attention, and when we stood for the hymn, he sang. Quietly, slightly flat, but sincerely. Rather like Gerald, actually, though I kept that observation to myself. After the service, he wished me a good morning and left without making any production of it. No hovering. No fishing for an invitation. Just a nod and a, "Good morning, Mrs. Clara," and off he went, back up the aisle. Mrs. Kowalski materialized at my elbow approximately 4 seconds later. "Well?" she said. "Well, what?" I said. "What did you think?" "I think," I said, picking up my bag, "that he sings slightly flat." Mrs. Kowalski beamed. In her system of interpretation, I had apparently just said something very promising. Chapter 5. What Habits Are For. It is now late October, almost a full year since the carnations began, and I am sitting in the third pew from the front, left side, St. Brendan's Church of the Redeemer, corner of Maple and Glenwood. Gerald is sitting beside me. This is not, I want to be precise about this, a love story of the obvious kind. It is not the kind of story where the grieving widow meets a kind man, and everything resolves into the comfortable shape of a second beginning, with a swell of music and a warm golden light through an amber window. Or rather, it is not only that story. Life is rarely only one story. It tends to be several stories, layered over each other, the way voices in a hymn occupy the same moment from different angles. Gerald comes to Mass most Sundays now. We have had coffee twice. Once after the Christmas pageant, which featured a camel made of papier-mâché that lost a leg during the procession, and caused 6-year-old Tommy Riley to burst into actual tears on behalf of the camel, which Gerald found so funny he had to cover his mouth with his hand. And once just because it was a cold morning and the parish hall had a decent urn going. We have spoken about our respective children, our respective habits, his career in regional insurance, my 31 years with Gerald. He had 30 years with his wife, Patricia, who died of a stroke on an ordinary Wednesday, and who liked jazz and gardening, and thought regional insurance was not what she'd imagined for her life. But that life tends to give you more than you imagined anyway. Which Gerald repeats as though it is a text he is still working out the full meaning of. I understand that, actually. Gerald comes to Mass with me still. I know how that sounds, and I'm not going to dress it up in theological language or apology. He comes the way a habit carries a person. Not as a ghost, not as a memory exactly, but as a shape that has been pressed so long into the fabric of a life that it remains after everything else has changed, the way a chair holds the impression of the person who used to sit in it. He is in the light through the amber window. He is in the slight squeak of the board at the right end of the pew. He is in the duck. Or the boat. Carved near the hymnal holder. Which I've decided is whichever one I want it to be on any given Sunday. What I've come to understand, over these 3 years of sitting in this pew, and leaving a seat empty beside me, and accumulating carnations and knitted squares, and the slightly bewildered attention of an entire small parish, is that habits are not about the past. Or not only about the past. They are about keeping a door open. A habit says, "This is the shape of my life as I know it, and I will hold that shape even when everything inside it has shifted, because the shape is how I find my way back to myself each week." I held Gerald's shape in the pew for 3 years. I am still holding it. The seat beside me was his, and it will always have been his, and that is not in conflict with Gerald sitting in it now. Or not in the way people might imagine. A seat can hold more than one person, across time. That's rather the point of having seats at all. Today, Father Dominic gives a homily about the nature of continuity. Not his word, he says, faithfulness. But I think it means the same thing. And about how the things we return to, again and again, are not signs of being stuck but of being rooted. I listen with my hands in my lap, and I think that Father Dominic is, for all his careful earnestness, a rather perceptive young man. Gerald, beside me, shifts slightly and opens his program with a small rustle. He leans over. Not to whisper something, not this week. Though he has been known to. And simply settles, the way a person settles when they are in a place they have started to recognize as theirs in some small way. I think about Gerald, and his habit of arriving a few minutes late, and his brief exhale of a greeting, and the way he'd squeeze my hand. I think about the compressed wholeness of that gesture. All the years and the ordinary Sundays and the burnt bacon breakfasts. The furniture rearranged and the chipped mug kept and the long, unremarkable, entirely irreplaceable texture of a shared life. Held in the span of a hand in a hand. A moment that took no time at all and took everything. The light through the amber window lands across the third pew, warm and slightly gold, just as it has for 34 years now, by my count. Mrs. Kowalski, 2 rows back, is watching. She is always watching. I don't begrudge her it. The world needs its watchers, its Rosalies and its Kowalskis. It's people who track the small movements of other people's lives with the dedicated attention that in another context might be called love. She catches my eye and gives me a small nod. The kind that contains a modest amount of, "I told you so," and an immodest amount of genuine warmth. I give her the look that says, "Don't push it, Dolores." She smiles. I smile back. The choir begins the opening hymn. Gerald, slightly flat but perfectly sincere, joins in on the second line. And I sit in my pew. Our pew, the third one from the front. And I think, yes. This is exactly as it should be. Not the same as it was, not quite. But close enough to the shape I know that I can find myself in it. Close enough that something in me settles. The way it always used to. When Gerald would slide in beside me, breathe his small exhale, and let me know that this, right here, was where we both were meant to be. Some habits, you see, are not cages. Some habits are how you keep the door open. Not to the past, but to the whole, continuous, surprising, lopsided duck or boat life that keeps arriving. Sunday after Sunday, whether you planned for it or not. Gerald would have liked Gerald, I think. He would have said something about the singing, of course. He wasn't a saint. But he would have liked him. And he would have told me, with that particular fondness that borders on exasperation. "Clara, you magnificent stubborn woman. You always end up exactly where you're supposed to be." Well, he wasn't wrong. He very rarely was.